Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope everyone is doing well today. So today's case is about the mysterious disappearance of the Sodder children back in 1945. In the early hours of Christmas Day, a devastating house fire changed their lives forever. The Sodder parents, George and Jenny, and 4 of their children managed to escape mostly unharmed, but sadly 5 of their children had been trapped inside the house. And by the time the fire had finally died down and authorities began sifting through the rubble and ash looking for the bodies, they couldn't find anything. There was no trace of the kids found. And so the Sodder parents began desperately searching for answers. And as they're digging into all of these strange events leading up to the fire, they start to think that this fire had been set intentionally and someone had taken their children. And the disappearance of the Sodder children would become one of America's strangest mysteries. Before we get into today's case, I'd like to tell you all about today's sponsor, Paired. Paired is a relationship care app that offers couples a unique way to strengthen and maintain a healthy and happy relationship. The app has tons of relationship games, couple questions, there are little relationship exercises you can do, and they also offer videos created by relationship experts on subjects like communication and intimacy. And this app is for couples at any stage of a relationship, so even if you're just starting out, Paired would actually be a great way to get to know your new partner. My husband and I have had a lot of fun using this app together. We've been cracking up at some of our responses. We've been together for a very, very long time, since we were just immature little teenagers, and I really feel like we grew up together. So I thought that there was nothing that we didn't know about each other. But after we took some of the quizzes and answered some of the questions, we were actually both pretty surprised by some of the answers. We typically answer the questions and games and stuff during the workday when we're not together, and then we always end up talking and laughing about it when we come home from work. So it's definitely opened up some interesting conversations. My favorite are the games that test how well you know your partner. You'll be asked to answer a set of questions like how you would answer them, and then you'll be asked the same set of questions, except this time you answer how you think your partner would respond. Those are my favorite because in the end you get to see how well you both scored, and you are competing against each other to see who knows who best. And you'll be surprised by some of your partner's answers, I promise you. There's even a feature that allows you to create a timeline of the most important and meaningful moments of your relationship. We have both thoroughly enjoyed using Paired. We do the daily question every morning. It's become like a fun little part of our routine. So even if you've been together for years and years like us, or you're just starting out, Paired would make a great addition to any relationship. And Paired is kindly offering my viewers a free 7-day trial and 25% off of Paired Premium when you click the link in the description box. Thanks again to Paired for sponsoring this video, and now let's jump into the case. This story begins on the evening of Christmas Eve, 1945 in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Jenny and George Sodder were busy preparing their home for Christmas Day celebrations. The Sodder family's tradition was to let their kids open up a few of their Christmas gifts on Christmas Eve, and then they would wait until the next morning to open up everything else. And they were just having a great night kicking off all of the Christmas festivities. The Sodder's second oldest son, Joe, was the only member of the family that was missing that night. He had served in World War II, and he was currently stuck in North Carolina waiting to be officially discharged so that he could return home to his family. By 10 p.m., George and Jenny were ready to turn in, but 5 of the younger kids asked if they could stay up a little bit later that night. They were just having so much fun playing with their toys, and they just weren't ready to go to bed. Typically, Jenny and George were pretty strict about their bedtime, but it was Christmas Eve, it was the holidays, so Jenny told them that they could stay up a little bit later, but she reminded them that they needed to do the last of their chores before they went to bed. The children were supposed to close all the blinds and all the curtains, and they were supposed to lock up all the doors before bed. And 2 of the boys were in charge of feeding the cows and closing up the chicken coop. The kids promised that they would take care of all the chores before bed, so Jenny and George took their youngest child, 3-year-old Sylvia, and the 3 of them headed to bed. At around 11:30 p.m., 2 of the older boys, John and George Jr., decided to go ahead and turn in. So the way this house was set up, you have George and Jenny's room downstairs. There's also an office, a kitchen, dining room, and a living room downstairs. Then upstairs, there was 1 room for the boys and 1 room for the girls. So all 9 of the kids who were currently living at home shared these 2 rooms. So John and George Jr., they go upstairs to the 1 bedroom that all of the boys shared, and they fell asleep. The oldest daughter, Marianne, stayed up in the living room reading a magazine while the 5 younger kids continued to play with their toys. One of Marianne's responsibilities was to make sure that the younger ones got into bed every night, so she stayed up because the younger kids were still awake. But at some point, Marianne dozed off on the couch before she put the kids to bed. So that left 15-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 6-year-old Betty up alone in the house. At around 12:30 a.m., Jenny Sodder was woken up by a phone call. The family had a landline set up in the office, so she got up and she walked through the house towards the office to answer the phone. But when she picked up, she didn't recognize the person on the other end of the line. It was a woman asking to speak to someone who Jenny didn't know. So Jenny tells the woman that she has the wrong number, and she would later say that she could hear a man's voice in the background, and it sounded like there may have been a party going on wherever this person was calling from. So Jenny heads back to bed, but as she's walking towards her bedroom, she notices that Marianne had fallen asleep on the couch, and the younger 5 who had asked to stay up that night, they were not in the living room anymore. So Jenny assumes that Marianne must have already put the kids to bed, and she had just decided to stay up a bit later, and she dozed off on the couch. So at this point, there are no alarm bells going off in Jenny's mind. But before she goes to bed, she also notices that the chores had not been done. The curtains were still open and the doors were still unlocked. So Jenny thinks, well, okay, the kids must have just been really tired and they just forgot to do them before bed. So she went ahead and did it. She closed the curtains, she locked up the doors, and then she went back to her room and she fell back to sleep. But then not even an hour later, Jenny is woken up again. This time she's woken up to the sound of something loud crashing on the metal roof of the house. Jenny and George's bedroom was downstairs, like I said, but there was no upstairs part of the house above their bedroom. So the metal roof was right above their room. So when whatever this was hit the metal roof of their house, it made a really, really loud sound and it woke Jenny up. She later described it as sounding like a hard ball or a rock hitting the highest pitch of their roof and then sliding down into the gutter. So Jenny just laid there for a while, just listening to see if anything else would happen, but nothing did. It was just that one loud bang on the roof. So again, she just closed her eyes and she fell back to sleep. But then not long after Jenny heard that strange sound, she was woken up again. But this time she woke up to the smell of smoke coming from inside the house. She immediately jumps up, she wakes up George, and she runs out of the room. And as soon as she opens up the door, she's just hit with blankets of smoke. Jenny's first thought was to head to the office to call for help. But when she got there, she saw where she assumed the fire was coming from. She described what she saw as a virtual sheet of flames descending from one corner of the office near a desk and around the telephone. So she couldn't reach the phone. It was just way too hot for her to walk further into the office. So she turns and she runs back towards the front of the house and she just starts screaming as loud as she possibly can to wake up her kids. Marianne, who was still on the couch, is startled awake by Jenny screaming, so she jumps up and she immediately runs into her parents' bedroom and she grabs up her 3-year-old little sister Sylvia and she runs out of the house, while George and Jenny are still trying to alert the kids upstairs. The 2 older boys, John and George Jr., the 2 who had went upstairs on their own around 11:30, they came down the stairs, but no other kids followed. Now, this happened in the 1940s, so houses were not built with the same attention to safety as they are now, especially fire safety. There wasn't really fireproofing of homes back then, which meant that if a house caught fire, it was likely going to burn very quick. So the Sodders know that they need to act fast. They need to get their children out of the house. So like I said, John and George Jr., they come down the stairs and they did manage to make it out of the house safely, although they both did suffer some burns on the way out. But by the time that George and Jenny realized that the other 5 kids hadn't made it down the stairs, it was too late for them to go up. The flames had started to completely engulf the staircase. So they needed to find another way to get up there and get them out. The family always kept a ladder on the side of their house. So George's plan was to climb up the ladder and enter the house through a window and then pull the kids out that way. So he and Jenny run outside and George runs around the side of the house, but when he went to grab the ladder, it was gone. This ladder was always kept in the same exact location, but now it was missing. George is in an absolute panic now and he doesn't know what to do. So out of just sheer desperation and determination, he starts attempting to climb the side of the house to get up to the window. But at some point during all the chaos, George had sliced his arm pretty badly on a broken window and he was bleeding profusely. So this attempt to climb up the side of the house was never going to work. He was literally just sliding down on his own blood. So then he tries to use his work trucks. He thinks that if he can move the work trucks as close to the side of the house as possible, he can climb on top of the truck and then get into the window. window. But when he went to attempt this, neither of the trucks would start. So while George is trying to figure out how to get the kids out of the house, Jenny heads over to a neighbor's house and she asked the neighbor to call the fire department. But the neighbor told Jenny that she had been trying to call them because at this point, the fire was raging. Everyone in the neighborhood knew what was happening, and there were so many onlookers that had already gathered in front of the house. Some of the onlookers were offering help. They were trying to help George figure out how to reach the kids, and others were just watching in total shock and horror. So like I said, the neighbor had been trying to call the fire department before Jenny had even arrived at her house, but she wasn't having any luck. The switchboard operator wasn't answering. So several other people were attempting to contact the fire department, people who had been passing by and seen the fire, neighbors. Some of the onlookers had went to go try to alert the fire department to send help. Eventually, a man named Thomas Smith finally managed to get someone to answer. And Thomas Smith would later report that the person who picked up at the fire department was the fire chief. His name was Chief Morris. And Chief Morris will become very important to this case. So Thomas tells Chief Morris there's a fire at the Sodder house. You guys need to get over here. And Chief Morris says, we already know about the fire. We're aware of what's going on, but he didn't say anything else. So Thomas is like, okay, well, are you guys coming? Like, what's going on? And Chief Morris responded, I don't know. And so Thomas says, there are 5 children trapped upstairs in this house. You guys need to come and help. But Chief Morris said nothing after that. He never said, okay, we're on our way. We're going to be there as fast as we can. He didn't give any advice on maybe what they can do in the meantime before the fire department arrived. He didn't say anything. And so George and Jenny Sodder, along with 4 of their children and tons of onlookers, watched as their home completely burned to the ground. It only took 45 minutes for everything to be destroyed. And 8 hours later, the fire department finally showed up. And the fire department was only 2.5 miles from the Sodder home. So why did it take that long? The excuse that they later gave was that the fire department was mostly made up of volunteer firefighters, and a lot of these men were serving in the military, so they were having a hard time finding people to come help. Chief Morris also said that there had been a snowstorm recently, and so it was really hard for them to drive the 2.5 miles to the Sodder home. But if all of that was true, why didn't he say something when Thomas Smith called him? Why didn't he say, we're working on it, we're going to be there as soon as we can, we're just having a hard time finding people to help, or we're having a hard time navigating the roads? But he didn't mention any of that. And these excuses have been called into question. First of all, this was happening at the very end of World War II. It might have even been after the war was over. So most of the volunteers had returned by now. And even still, why hadn't the chief at least done something? Literally nothing was done until 8 hours later. Also, taxis and buses were easily able to drive the streets that night. Like I said, some of the onlookers who went out to find a phone to call the fire department, most of them were driving around trying to search for a payphone, and they were able to get around just fine. So the snowstorm excuse is questionable as well. But either way, by the time the fire department arrived, there was pretty much nothing left. So once everything had cooled down, the search began for the 5 children. There were several volunteers helping the fire department in the search. There were neighbors, various people from the community, and George Sodder owned a successful trucking company, so some of his employees had also showed up to help. Everyone was just desperately trying to find any trace of these 5 kids so that their parents could at least give them a proper burial. But by the end of the search, they had found nothing. There was no trace of the children, not even a bone was found. And so Chief Morris told George and Jenny that there was nothing left of the kids. He said that they had searched the site with a fine-toothed comb and came up completely empty. So he suggested that they collect some of the ash from the fire so that George and Jenny could bury that in place of their children's remains. But George didn't want to do this. He said that he was not going to bury ash in place of his children. He wanted some sort of remains. He wanted his children's remains. And Jenny was also arguing with the chief. She said that there was no way that they wouldn't have found at least some bones. There were 5 children that supposedly died in this fire, and they couldn't find anything, not even a tooth. When the initial report on the fire was released, it was stated that the cause was undetermined, but it had likely started at the home's electrical switch box, and it had been an electrical fire due to old faulty wiring. But George and Jenny weren't buying this either. The wiring had recently been completely updated, and the person who had done this was licensed and very experienced. George also argued that if the electrical box had been the source of the fire, then the lights in the house would have gone out. But the lights were still on when they were fleeing from the home. And they know that the lights were still on because the lights had helped them to see well enough to navigate their way out of the house. Smoke had completely filled the home, making it really hard to see, but the lights had helped to guide them out. It's believed that the reason that it was ruled an electrical fire was because of what Jenny said about seeing the fire coming from that corner of the office. The electrical box was located near the outside of that wall. The authorities told Jenny and George that they would be back in a couple of days to investigate further, but they never came back. And just 5 days after the fire, death certificates were issued for all 5 of the kids. They had no bodies, not even a trace of any of the kids, but yet they were quickly issued death certificates. It was like the authorities wanted this to just all be done and dealt with, and it was just case closed for them. Now, this fire and the deaths of the 5 children, or what was thought to be the deaths of the 5 children at the time, was massive news all over the country. People could not believe what had happened to this family, and for it to happen on Christmas, a time when you're supposed to be making memories with your loved ones, it just made the whole thing even more heartbreaking. And so curious people started to turn up at the site of the fire, which at this point was just basically just a big hole in the ground. People from all over the area started stopping by to just stare at the site. Some people were probably there to pay their respects, but most of them were likely there out of morbid curiosity. And at this point, George and Jenny were living in another house, but this house was only 150 feet from the site of their old house. And so they could see these people showing up day and night. And George finally had enough. He was sick and tired of these people just stopping by to stare at the hole in the ground. And he just couldn't stand the thought that these random people could be standing on his children's ashes. So he made the decision to fill in the hole with dirt. And to do this, he hired a man named Jimmy Cipriani. And Jimmy Cipriani was Jenny Sodder's brother. So Jimmy has the hole filled with dirt, and George and Jenny decide to make this a memorial site for their dead children. They wanted this to be like their own little cemetery for their kids, a place where their family could visit and pay their respects for the rest of their lives. And after the hole was filled in, the Sodders laid down 5 wreaths with each of the children's names. Then on Sunday, December 31st, a group funeral service was held on the site. Joe Sodder, the son who had been away at the army base at the time of the fire, he was finally home, and so he and the rest of his surviving siblings attended the funeral service along with tons of people from the area. But George and Jenny decided that they just couldn't attend. They were both just so completely beside themselves with grief. They were just barely even functioning. In fact, I forgot to mention this earlier, but when George was finally taken to the hospital to treat the cuts on his arms, he also had to be treated for shock. He was in just an absolutely horrible state of shock. So now that the children had been given a funeral, George and Jenny really tried to move on. You know, they had to be strong for their other kids. But as time went on, more and more strange bits of information started to come to light. So remember that noise that Jenny Sodder heard on the roof right before the fire started? Well, a man came forward to say that he had been driving the city bus that night, and he just happened to be passing by the Sodder house right before the fire started. And he claimed that he saw what looked like fireballs rolling onto the roof of the Sodder home and into the gutter. It's not really known why the man didn't report this at the time, like why didn't he call for help, but he was on duty, he was doing his bus route, and it was like 1 a.m, so maybe that's why he didn't say anything. We don't really know, and this man has never been publicly identified. And what happened to the ladder that night? The Sodder family said that that ladder literally stayed in that same spot at all times unless it was needed for something, but then it was always put right back in the same spot. But for some reason that night it was missing, and they did eventually find the ladder, but it was located in a really random spot. They found it 75 feet away from the home in a ravine, and it looked like someone had purposely placed it there. It was also revealed that on the night of the fire, a local man named Lonnie Johnson was seen taking a set of chain hoists from the Sodder barn. These chain hoists were used in George's trucking business to lift up like truck parts and stuff. And this was happening either like right before the fire started or literally as the house was actively burning down. Then a few days after the fire, when the Sodders were having a phone line set up at the new home, the person working on the line told them something very interesting. The old phone line had been cut. So who would have cut the phone line and why? Lonnie Johnson at some point told police that he was responsible for cutting the line because he heard that the fire was electrical. So he thought he was cutting the electricity off off when he was actually cutting the phone line. But it's important to mention here that Lonnie Johnson was well known as a liar around town. He had been busted lying about lots of things in the past. He had a criminal record. He just couldn't be considered a trusted source of information. And Lonnie never mentioned cutting the phone line in his original statement to police. Why would he be in the middle of stealing stuff from the barn, see the fire, and think, okay, well, I'm going to be a hero and go cut the power to stop the fire? And why would he think that cutting that line would have done anything to help? The house was completely up in flames. The damage was done. It just didn't make any sense. But the strangest part of this whole thing is that even though Lonnie Johnson had admitted that he was there around the time of the fire, he admitted he had stolen property from the Sodders, and he claimed that he cut the phone line, the authorities still didn't consider him a potential suspect in starting the fire. Another strange thing happened just a few days after the fire. 4 people that the Sodders had never seen before arrived at their new home, and they asked the Sodders if they could, quote, see their babies. Ginny and George would later say that these people made them feel really uncomfortable, and they kind of gave them the feeling that they were trying to feel them out to see if they were suspicious about anything. It was just a very strange interaction, and they never saw those people again after that day. And again, this was told to the police, but nothing was looked into. Now, for 18 months following the fire, George and Ginny accepted the findings in the report, and they thought their kids had actually died in the fire. They didn't think that the fire was accidental. At this point, they really thought that someone had set this fire on purpose, but they did at least accept that their children had died in the fire. They didn't understand why nothing was found. They really thought that some remains should have been found, but they had just kind of accepted it, that their kids had died that night. But then a man named Reverend Frame enters the story. Reverend Frame was a member of the local Masonic Lodge, and Fire Chief Morris just happened to also be a member of that same lodge. And one day in 1947, Chief Morris told Reverend Frame that he had actually found human remains at the site of the Sodder fire. He said that he had gone back alone to search the ash later Christmas night after everyone else had left, and he had found a human heart. He said he then put the heart in a box and he buried it on the property. So Reverend Frame decides to just mention this to George and Ginny Sodder to see if they had ever heard of this before, and they were shocked. Chief Morris had never ever mentioned this to them. It was now a year and a half after the fire, and as far as they knew, nothing had ever been found. He had told them that he had searched the site with a fine-tooth comb and found nothing. But now they're finding out that he actually did find proof that the children did die that night in the fire. So George and Ginny, they immediately go confront Chief Morris. And Chief Morris is like, oh yeah, like I thought I told you that. Yeah, I found a heart that night on the property and I just put it in a box and I buried it. And the Sodders tell him, no, you never told us that. We would definitely remember if you told us that you had found remains of our children. So George and Ginny have so many questions, and they immediately want to see this heart that Chief Morris supposedly found. But then Morris started acting dodgy, not answering calls, not returning calls, just making any excuse not to meet up with them in person. But George and Ginny were not going to give up, and so Morris finally has the box dug up, and inside they found what looked like an organ of some sort, but they couldn't really make out what it was. Morris was calling it a heart, but it was really hard to tell. And at this point, George and Ginny were getting a little suspicious of the Fayetteville authorities, so they decide to take the box to Montgomery, which is about 25 miles away, and they have a funeral home examine the heart. They also had a portion of it sent off to a lab, and both the funeral home and the lab came to the same conclusion. This was not a heart at all. It was actually a liver, and it wasn't even human. This was a beef liver, and it had never been exposed to a fire. There was no burning, no scarring, no scorching, nothing on this liver. And if it had been exposed to the fire that night at the Sodder home, it would have been firm and cooked essentially. But this was just like a piece of liver that you would go buy at the grocery store. So this looks really bad on Chief Morris. It really seems as though he planted that liver on the property. He definitely hadn't found it there. Chief Morris also went through more than one inquest concerning the initial findings at the site, and he never once mentioned finding any remains. In fact, his initial report stated that he found nothing at all. And when he was later asked why he hadn't mentioned finding the heart that night in the fire, he said, well, no one asked me. You need to be asked if you found a human heart. Morris finally did admit that he had planted the liver on the property, but his excuse was that he knew that the kids were dead and he just wanted to give George and Jenny some closure and peace about the situation. But if that really was the truth, then why didn't he tell George and Jenny that he had found it there? It was over a year later before it finally came out that this had even been found, and he wasn't even the one that had told him about it. It's far more likely that Morris had been instructed to plant that liver so the authorities could falsely claim that they had evidence that the kids had really died that night, but they never mentioned this to George or Jenny, probably because they knew that George and Jenny would want to see the heart and they would probably have it examined and then they would be caught in a lie. And now the Sodders really started to feel like they just couldn't trust any of the officials in Fayetteville anymore. To them, it just looked like one giant cover up. Then around the same time, Jenny and George hear about another tragic house fire, and a few people died in this fire, including a very young child. And in this case, skeletal remains of the victims were found, which made George and Jenny question things even more. And now they really are starting to believe that something really sinister went on that night. And as they're digging into all these details, they start to believe that their children had not died that night in the fire. So in an attempt to discredit this theory that the kids had been completely incinerated, including their bones, the Sodders go and speak to a mortuary and they start asking questions about the cremation process. And they ask them, when you cremate a body, does it completely burn to ash? Is there any trace of the body left over once the process is done? And they tell the Sodders that the bodies that they cremate are cremated at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for about 2 hours, depending on the size of the person. And even after being exposed to extremely high heat like that for that long, there are still full bones left over. And the Sodder fire had only burned for 45 minutes. So George and Jenny come to the conclusion that there was just no way all of the bones had been reduced to ash. And they're convinced that someone had taken their children and then intentionally started the fire. So now they just start searching their brains and trying to think of anything strange in the months leading up to the fire, or, who would have wanted to do this to them? Well, it turns out that George Sodder wasn't very well liked by some of the people in the community. George had come to America from Italy when he was only 13 years old. He first moved to New York, and when he arrived in America, he just completely embraced the culture and the traditions of Americans. He eventually left New York and he moved to a town called Smithers, West Virginia, and he got a job working for a man named Fiorenzo Gianatola at a trucking company. George and Jenny eventually met, they fell in love, and they started to build their family. And after a little while, George starts to think, I really know the trucking business really well. I think that maybe it's time for me to set off on my own and start my own business, which is exactly what he did. He started his own trucking business and he named it the Sodder Trucking Company. His older sons would help out at the business. Jenny would do the books, and the business was actually doing really well. Now, at this time, there was a large population of Italian Americans living in Fayetteville, West Virginia. And for the most part, George got along with all of them really well. They had all come from very similar backgrounds and they had a lot in common. But the one thing that they didn't have in common was loyalty to Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was an Italian dictator and he's considered to be the father of fascism. And most of the Italian population in Fayetteville supported Mussolini, and they would get very, very defensive and angry if someone ever badmouthed him. And George did not like Mussolini at all. He didn't support him or how he was leading the country, and he was very loud and outspoken about his feelings. He didn't care who knew that he hated Benito Mussolini. And so he started to really piss some people off. Even people who had once been his friends started to distance themselves from him. And some of the friends that he pissed off were members of the Gianatolo family, including his previous employer, Fiorenzo Gianatolo. And this is where things really start to look suspicious. Like there actually might have been a plot against the Sodder family. A private investigator that was hired by George and Jenny named C.C. Tinsley found that one of the Gianatolos had been involved in the coroner's inquest. This inquest had determined the official ruling on how the fire started and what had happened to the kids that night. And the findings were that the kids were dead. Even without any evidence of their bodies, they were determined to be dead and the fire was determined to be accidental. And a man named Cleante Gianatolo, who was a relative of Fiorenzo's, was a member of that inquest. and he had actually signed all 5 of the Sodder kids' death certificates. And not only that, but Cleante had been appointed the director of a bank in town, and his relative Fiorenzo was the sole beneficiary of the Sodder's home insurance policy. Fiorenzo had co-signed for the Sodder home years earlier when they purchased it. I believe that George at the time was still working for Fiorenzo, and he had helped them to get the house. And apparently he was made the beneficiary on the insurance papers. I don't know if Fiorenzo did this or George did this, or maybe Fiorenzo talked George into doing this, but the Genitolo family were very much supporters of Mussolini, and they did not like the things that George was saying about him. And in the weeks leading up to the fire, Fiorenzo had tried to convince George to increase the policy amount on the home insurance policy, but George had refused. Then after he refused to do that, Fiorenzo sent an insurance agent named Russell Long to speak to George about taking out life insurance policies on his children. But again, George refused. So Fiorenzo starts to get annoyed that George is declining all of this additional coverage. So he decides to pay George a visit. And during this visit, he threatens George. He says that if he doesn't take out these policies, quote, your house will go up in smoke and your children will be destroyed. And he also threatened George that something bad would happen if he didn't stop bad-mouthing Mussolini. Then just a few weeks after Genitolo made that threat, a strange man showed up at the Sodder home asking for work. And when George told the man that he didn't have any job openings currently, the man then walked around the back of the house where the electrical box was, and he said, quote, that's going to cause a fire someday. This comment seemed kind of threatening to George. And like I said, they had already had a professional electrician come and upgrade all of their electrical wiring in the house. It was all brand new. So why would the man have made a comment like that? And then the following month, the Sodder home was destroyed in a fire. So was the man sent there by the Genitolos to kind of scope out the house because he was a part of this plot against the Sodder family? It also came out that in the weeks leading up to the fire, some of the older Sodder children saw a car that they had never seen before started showing up in the neighborhood, and it would park near their house. And the people in the car would just sit there and stare in the direction of the Sodder house. And sometimes they would even watch the younger kids while they were playing outside. It just really seemed to George and Jenny that there was just something weird going on in Fayetteville. They really felt like there was this big conspiracy against them. So eventually George decides to have the site of the fire excavated. He wants to know once and for all if there's anything down there, any bones, any teeth, anything to give them any indication that their children had actually died that night. And at this point, he's kind of kicking himself for filling in the hole in the first place. His intentions had been good. He wanted to give his children a nice place to rest, but that was back when he believed that the kids had died. So he has the site dug up, and once everything is said and done, a few bone fragments were actually found. Some of these bones were determined to be animal bones, but there were 4 small pieces of vertebrae that were found. So they were sent off to be analyzed, and it was confirmed that they were human bones. The report said that these bones likely belonged to a human male between the ages of 14 and 15, which would line up with one of the missing kids, 15-year-old Maurice. However, the lab also noted that they did not believe these bones came from any of the kids because there was 0 signs of burning on these bones. They definitely had not been through a fire. Well, it turns out that the dirt that was used to fill in the pit had actually come from a cemetery. So it's believed that those bones were present in the dirt and they were transported with the dirt to the site of the Sodder fire. Some people also think that those bones were planted on the property to make George and Jenny stop searching for the kids, but it hadn't worked. This only fueled their determination. Then in 1952, a woman named Ida Crutchfield contacted the police. Ida was the owner of a hotel called the Alderson Hotel in Charleston, and she said that a few days after the fire, 4 of the 5 Sodder children, along with several Italian-speaking adults, came into her hotel. Ida got the feeling that something wasn't right with the situation. At this point, she didn't know anything about the missing Sodder kids, but the situation just seemed a little off to her. And so she attempted to talk to the kids, but before she could ask any questions, the adults intervened and they shut down the conversation. Ida came forward with this information 7 years after the fire, so the chances of following any kind of trail seemed slim to none, but it didn't matter anyways because the police didn't investigate Ida's story. Another potential witness came forward and said that she had witnessed the 5 kids being loaded into a car that night right before the fire and she watched them being driven away. And another person came forward and said that she saw the children with a strange man at a diner the night that they were taken. But unfortunately, this was at a time before security cameras. There were no smartphones, so none of these accounts can be proven. But you would think that the authorities would at least want to investigate these things further. They just seemed dead set on the fire being accidental and that the children had died. So September of 1953, the Sodders erected a billboard offering $5,000 to anyone with information leading to the discovery of their children. And over the years, they did receive a lot of false leads with the occasional promising lead mixed in. George and Jenny followed every single one of these leads, sometimes traveling miles and miles away from Fayetteville, but they always came back disappointed. But there were a couple of pretty promising leads that came several years after the fire. In 1966, a woman from Texas contacted the Sodders to tell them that she overheard two men talking in a bar one night, and one of the men said that he was Maurice Sodder, the boy who had been missing for decades. So George immediately heads to Texas, and he does manage to track down these two men, and he said they looked just like his two missing sons. So he flat out asks them, "Are you my children? Like, are you my sons?" And they tell George that, "No, I'm sorry, we're not actually your children." And George was absolutely crushed when he came home from this trip because he left Texas really believing that he had just sat down with two of his children. No matter what the two men said, he believed that they were actually his children. Then in 1967, an anonymous envelope showed up at the Sodder house, and it had been sent from Central City, Kentucky. And inside of the envelope was the photo of a man. And on the back of the photo were the words, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ILIL boys, and A90132 or 35. George and Jenny were convinced that the man in this photo was Louis. This was their son, Louis. Louis was 9 years old at the time of the fire, so he would have been in his 30s by this point. And I'll put a side-by-side on the screen and you tell me what you think if you think this does look like Louis Sodder. Now, the brother Frankie part was confusing though because the Sodders didn't know anyone named Frankie. They had no relatives named Frankie, so who was Frankie? If this photo really was of Louis, could Frankie be one of the kidnappers? They didn't know what this part meant. But they did come to the conclusion that the 5 digits, the 90132 or 35, were probably postal codes. So they start checking all the codes from the United States to see, where this code matched up with, but there was nowhere in America with that postal code. But the numbers do match an area of Italy. Specifically, they match codes from Palermo, Sicily. And Palermo is where a large mafia organization was located. So George and Jenny start to think that maybe this is somehow mob related. Maybe the Gianitolos were connected with this crime family, and that's how they heard about George and all the things he was saying. Maybe they had helped the Gianitolos to start the fire and take the children. But when George and Jenny realized that there was a potential that the mob could be involved, they kind of got panicked. They didn't know what would happen to them if they went public with this information. So they kind of kept it out of the public. They didn't really say much about it. Instead, they hired another private investigator, and they wanted this investigator to go to Central City, Kentucky, where the letter had been originally sent from, and they wanted him to track down whoever sent it. So the investigator headed to Central City, Kentucky, but he was never seen or heard from again. Now, it's very possible that this private investigator just took the Sodders' money and just ran, but there is the possibility that something bad might have happened to the investigator in Kentucky. Maybe someone didn't like the fact that he was asking all these questions. And after this, the Sodders, they went to the authorities and they tried to get them to at least look into this lead, but they wouldn't do it. And the most heartbreaking thing about this lead in particular is that George and Jenny saved that photo and they had it enlarged and framed and they put it up on the mantle with photos of their children. They just really wanted to believe that this really was Louis. There is one more theory surrounding this case, and it has to do with a place called the Tennessee Children's Home Society. And the Tennessee Children's Home Society was operated by a woman named Georgia Tann. And this society was essentially a front for child trafficking. Georgia Tann would trick vulnerable young single mothers to give up their children, and then she would sell them off to families for a high price and pocket the money. She would throw these big parties at the society's headquarters, and she would dress the children up all nice and invite families over to essentially just pick out whichever kid they wanted. And these families would pay Georgia thousands for these children. But some of these children hadn't been given up voluntarily. Some of them had actually been kidnapped. Several of the children in George's care ended up dying of neglect and abuse. And by 1950, the authorities had figured out what was going on and the society was shut down. But in the end, over 5,000 kids had been illegally taken from their birth parents to be sold off, and 19 kids had died. There is so much more to that story. I could literally do an entire video on that alone. So were the kids potentially kidnapped and sold off by Georgia Tan? It's a long shot. I personally don't believe that this is what happened, but it is important to note that this was all going on around the time that the Sodder kids disappeared. And some people believe that the kids really did die in the fire, and for some reason the remains were just never found. It seems highly unlikely that no remains would be found, but some people do believe that this truly was just a tragic accident and the kids really did die that night. But there are still just so many unanswered questions in this case, and unfortunately most, if not all, of the people involved are gone now, so the chances that we'll ever find out what actually happened to the Sodder kids that Christmas Eve night are very low. And it's likely that this will remain one of America's most bizarre mysteries. I really want to know what you guys think about this one. Do you think the kids died that night in the fire and somehow nothing was found? Or do you think that there was foul play? And also let me know if you guys would be interested in hearing cases about facilities like the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Remember to use my link to download Paired and get a 7-day free trial and 25% off of Paired Premium when you click the link in the description box. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.